Pedro Conceição is the director of our Human Development Report Office since 2019. He held many other positions in UNDP before, and he has a background in economics, public policy, and he is leading this research on global development trends since many years, but has also worked on Africa. Please run us through the report, and then we open the discussion. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you. Thank you, Dirk. Thank you, colleagues. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. And I want to start by confirming Dirk's description of the experience of working together, which is fun. But I'll describe it also as joyful and filled with hope. And I think that not only your work, Dirk, personally, but the work of Germany and the voice of Germany in the current international context is very important, and it's going to again gain expression in the Hamburg Sustainability Conference, which we are very much looking forward to. So I will present some of the key findings of the latest Human Development Report. I know that there's already been a discussion earlier this year with our administrator and minister as well. But I think it's probably a good moment to reflect on the findings of the report in light of some of the developments that have taken place since that time, since March of this year. And also looking forward, which is the most important thing, towards the summit of the future and beyond. So this Human Development Report, like every Human Development Report, is really an invitation for us to take a look at ourselves and make an assessment as to how are we doing. But how are we doing in a very specific way? How are we doing when it comes to this aspiration of expanding human development, which is a very simple notion. It's the notion that people should be able to live lives to their full potential. So one of the ways in which we try to quantify this idea of whether people are living lives to their full potential or not is by coming up with some numbers, some metrics. We have several, perhaps the most well-known of all is the Human Development Index. So the Human Development Index is a combination of an assessment as to how countries are doing when it comes to the performance of the economy. Economic performance is very important for people, for their livelihoods, for their standards of living, but it doesn't define fully this idea of enabling people to live lives to their full potential. So the Human Development Index includes also achievements in health and education. And if we look at what has happened recently when it comes to the global average Human Development Index, as Dirk mentioned, we have never had it so good. So the global average Human Development Index is at its highest value ever. But there are two important caveats to this good news. The first is what you see on this slide. So this slide shows the evolution of the Human Development Index, which is the blue line. And you can see that there was, for the first time ever, a decline in the Global Human Development Index in 2020 and 2021. It has rebounded in 2022, 2023, so this is the good news. But you see that the line of progress now lies below the line that we would be expecting had we not suffered this decline. Why is this important? Because that shaded part that you see on this chart, so the difference between the actual path of the Human Development Index and the potential path of the Human Development Index, had we not suffered the decline, represents a loss in human development, represents a loss in opportunity, in human potential, and represents a loss that if the line, the blue line, doesn't shift forward and the two lines continue to run parallel to each other, can be very long-lasting, potentially permanent. So I mention this because this idea that we sort of moved beyond the crisis of 2020, 2021, the multiple crises, and we are now sort of on the right path. Yes, we are on the right path, but we suffer this potential permanent loss, permanent scarring in human development. And the second very troubling development, and Dirk also alluded to this, has to do with the fact that for the first time ever, the difference between the level of the Human Development Index of the countries at the top and at the bottom is now increasing. So what you see on this slide, the blue line shows that this difference between the level of the Human Development Index of countries at the top and at the bottom has been declining for many years. This is development. This is what development is all about. The idea of development is that standards of living around the world will come together, converge towards the best possible. And this happened for many decades. But since 2020, this process of convergence in standards of living towards better standards of living is reversed. So behind me, you have the SDGs that come from the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development has a pledge to leave no one behind, a pledge to reach the furthest behind first. So what this tells us is that we are falling short in meeting this pledge. We are leaving the poorest and most vulnerable of our international community behind. And this happens not only across countries, but also within many countries. Recently, the European Commission asked the former Italian Prime Minister Enrico Letta to write a report on the single market. And in that report, Enrico Letta noted that one-third of the European population lives in regions that are also being left behind. Now, the report has an interpretation as to why we are finding ourselves in this situation. Of course, there are many reasons, but one key reason, in our view, has to do with the fact that we are not doing enough in managing interdependencies across countries, across societies, interlinkages, interconnections, as Dirk mentioned. No matter how well-resourced, best possible policies, doing everything right, a country that suffered the shocks we went through in 2020, 2021 wouldn't be able to insulate itself from a global pandemic. This is an example of the kind of problems that need to be managed collectively as an international community. So I just leave you with this idea that one of the reasons why we find ourselves in this situation has to do with our inability to manage interdependence. I'll come back to this notion at the end of my presentation. But we can go further and ask, why are we falling short in managing interdependence? Again, there are many reasons, for sure, but one of the reasons that we explore in our report is this fact that more and more societies around the world are becoming polarized. Polarization is very different from different people holding different views on policy priorities, allocation of resources, values. We need that. We need that diversity. That's what makes a society vibrant. That's what generates innovation. People thinking differently, proposing new things. That is not the problem. The problem is when societies become so divided on issues like whether we're doing too much or not enough on climate change, on how do we address health crisis, on how we deal with immigration. When these very fracturing issues separate societies apart, then we go into a situation of the gridlock of the report's title. And one of the ways in which we see evidence or implications, perhaps, of what this polarization generates, and by the way, as you see on the slide, this polarization has been happening in 2/3 of the world's countries since 2011, has been increasing. So it's something that we see in many parts of the world. It's not something that is specific to one or two countries. So what you see on this slide is the answer to two questions. First, on the horizontal axis, whether people believe in democracy and would like to live in a democratic system. And then on the vertical axis, you see the percentage of the population that would support a leader that might undermine democracy. And the points show how people around the world have responded to these two questions over time, essentially since the turn of the century. So what you see is that the dots are sort of moving up along a vertical line. What does this mean? That up to 90% of the global population is steadfast in its belief and its support to democracy as an ideal. But more and more, they're becoming also willing to support leaders that may undermine democracy. In fact, today, more than half of the global population, that's why we have that red bar on the chart, so a majority, if you will, of the global population would support leaders that may undermine democracy. So this is an illustration of the fact that up to two-thirds of the global population feel that their voice is not heard in the political system. And as a result, we see that democratic norms and practices are under pressure. By some accounts, they have now reached levels that we haven't seen since the mid-1980s. Another implication or manifestation of what we're seeing is that, as you see on the chart on the left, we are now seeing a peak in the number of governments that were elected based on platforms that are anti-elite and inward-looking, sometimes designated as populists. Unprecedented levels. And it's not an ideological thing, because you can see a breakdown between right and left, and it's basically of both varieties. And it's puzzling in a sense, because on the one hand, you see the chart on the right shows that it is costly economically. So these type of regimes tend to do less well economically than regimes that are not characterized by being inward-looking and by being anti-experts, anti-science, anti-elite. And this is costly also, perhaps more importantly, because it's driving an increase in forced displacement and people being killed in violent conflicts around the world, which are now reaching levels comparable, if not surpassing, those that we saw in the aftermath of World War II. Now, the report is also, or is meant to be hopeful and to provide a way forward, so maybe I should move towards what the report suggests we can do about all of these problems. Because we are not bound to accept this reality. We can do something to change it. So the report highlights three things that we can do. First is recognizing that even though traditionally there's been a lot of emphasis on improving well-being and redressing inequalities, one of the main drivers of some of the features that I've alluded to, particularly when it comes to polarization, has to do with insecurity, perceptions of insecurity. So we find that people that feel more insecure trust others less. So the Summit of the Future, one of the key objectives is to increase and enhance trust amongst countries and amongst people around the world. Well, one of the drivers of this lack of trust has to do with these perceptions of insecurity. People that feel more insecure also tend to be attracted to the extremes of the political spectrum, both on the left and on the right. So perceptions of insecurity are also associated with polarization. And then what you see on this chart is that the more insecure people feel, as you move on the horizontal axis from the left to the right, people report feeling, a larger proportion of people report feeling not in control of their lives. In other words, not having agency. So if these associations are robust, we have a tool here, a potential intervention, set of interventions that would seek to address these perceptions of insecurity, understand why people feel insecure, and find ways by addressing these perceptions that make people trust others more, ease polarization, and enhance a sense of agency. Secondly, actually, people agree on much more than they think they do. So I described the context in which we are polarized around many issues, one of which is whether we're doing too much or too little when it comes to climate change. Yet, when you ask people around the world, not if they believe in climate change, but if they would be willing to pay something, to suffer a financial penalty, to mitigate climate change, almost 70% of the global population responds yes to this question. It's not 100%, but it's 70%. It's a strong, big majority. But look at what the data on the right side of the slide says. If you ask people whether they think that people around them share the same conviction, this drops to 43%. So, people agree on more than they think they do. They actually agree, but they think they don't. Why is this important? Because to address problems like climate change, our personal commitment is not sufficient. No matter how much each of us individually is committed to addressing climate change, we know this is something that depends on collective action. And if we think that there is no collective action there, sometimes this is described as a context of pluralistic ignorance, then we are demobilized to take action. Even if we may take some actions individually to reduce our carbon footprint, for instance, in how we move ourselves, what we eat, we know this is not going to be enough. So these misperceptions between what we individually believe and what we think others believe, addressing these misperceptions by recognizing that we actually agree on more than we think, would be another way of addressing polarization. I'm giving here an example related to action on climate change, but the report has other examples on gender, for instance, or making advances toward gender equality, which, as Dirk said, is so important, or attitudes towards migration. So there are a range of issues that are very divisive, that are fracturing societies, that are polarizing societies, but actually people often agree on more than they think they do. And finally, and then I'll conclude, something to be done in the international context. This is, and Dirk alluded to this, we suggest that it's important to think through an architecture for the provision of global public goods. And being here in Berlin, I cannot but evoke the memory of Inga Kohl, with whom I worked very closely for many years, and was a pioneer in thinking about, and visionary really, and prescient, very prescient in recognizing the importance of global public goods. Because global public goods are things in which one country benefiting from is not at the expense of others. Many interactions between countries are competitive, are zero-sum, but when it comes to global public goods, they aren't. So an architecture for cooperation, for international cooperation, it is not premised necessarily only on the transfer of resources from rich to poor, but on this bigger aspiration of providing global public goods, things like climate change mitigation, controlling a pandemic, protecting biodiversity. These kind of things are to the benefit of every country. If a country takes some from the provision of a global public good like this, it's not at the expense of others. And it's very important also to recognize that this is the way to manage interdependence. And the slide that you have in front of you now paints a picture of the costs that we will incur looking forward if we fail to manage interdependence. So remember, I started by making the case that those problems that we have when it comes to the Global Human Development Index, the potential permanent losses and the return of divergence, had to do with the mismanagement of interdependence. But that's looking in the rear view mirror. This is looking ahead. So what this slide shows is the change in mortality rates in a scenario in which we fail to mitigate climate change. And you see different lines that represent countries with different levels of the Human Development Index. And the countries with the lowest level of the Human Development Index from now until the end of the century are the ones that are going to have the largest increases in mortality rates. And then the higher the level of the Human Development Index, the lower this increase in mortality rates. So looking forward, what we see if we fail to manage interdependence is a world in which we will witness an explosion of inequalities in human development. So what we saw in 2020, 2021 is a preview only of what's at stake here if we don't manage interdependence. So even though countries have many differences, many disputes, are competitive on many things, this does not imply that they cannot find arenas in which they can cooperate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro, for this great presentation. And maybe before you sit, if I can ask Pedro and everyone else in the panel to move to the chairs and introduce you. We have a panel. I've introduced Pedro. We have also Dr. Imme Scholz, who is the co-president of the Heinrich Böll Foundation and a renowned expert in environmental policy, sustainable development, with a strong focus on climate and biodiversity strategies. She has served as the deputy director of the German Development Institute for many years and has extensive experience in advising international institutions and governments on sustainable development. Thank you, Imme, for being here with us. And let me also welcome Olumide Abidomala, who is a very good partner of UNDP here in Berlin. We have done several events already, and is a political researcher and expert in trade policy, regional integration, natural resource management, and he's the founder and executive director of the Africa Policy Research Institute. And before that, he worked at the G7 Connex initiatives and the African Development Bank, and has done much research on Africa Visa Openness Index, Africa Regional Integration, and he holds a PhD from Max Planck Institute. Thank you also for being with us, and thank you, Pedro, for staying with us. I will move up as well. And I think there's a lot that we can and should discuss. And maybe, Imme, I start with you. And maybe given your function at the moment at the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and I think we had a discussion a few months ago on that, digging a bit more into this democracy paradox and the lack of trust that Pedro has described. And I think you're very familiar of these challenges that democratic institutions are facing. And at the same time, I think the importance of continuing supporting these systems. So in your view, how can we regain this trust that Pedro has explained that we have lost? I think there was one explanation about security, but I think there are many more. And what strikes me, the more I do this work on development and on the future of how we look at development, is that it becomes more and more universal. It becomes very divided, but it becomes also very universal, meaning that that countries are facing the same challenges, maybe driven by the same drivers of a lack of trust, maybe by different ones. So maybe if you can reflect on that as well a bit. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Melanie. This is, you try to give the positive answer, so what can we do about it? But I think when we look at the public debate in our countries, what we see is we know very well how to destroy things, how to destroy trust, how to prevent actually public policy institutions to be effective. And so to turn it around and really think more concretely how to foster trust is quite difficult. And I actually went back to this concept elaborated by colleagues at IDOS and I also was very happy to see it actually in the HDR. You know what I'm talking about. So social cohesion as a term to understand the role of trust actually in having a working society, a society which does not ignore its challenges, but actually has the confidence in its own, both in its public institutions and in its people, to work together, so in its ability to cooperate actually, and at the same time to tolerate differences across it. So I think, and I have applied it now to the climate crisis as being one very important source of insecurity, of losing trust actually in a possible positive future for ourselves. I think one important ingredient would actually be to have political forces agreeing, so understanding and agreeing that that climate change is a real problem, and which affects us all, and that requires a contribution by all. And that would mean actually to say climate change is not depending on your political party affiliation, whether you take it seriously or not. And so I think that's one difference then I would see, I could also draw from the report you just presented. The general public agrees in its majority that climate change is a real problem, but do political forces and political debates reflect that? So you say this is, by not doing it, this is polarization is produced. So that's why I come back. We know how to destroy it, but how do we actually change course without acknowledging we have been wrong on this? Yeah, I think that is a difficulty I see in political debates, to acknowledge I have been wrong here and let's start anew. So I think, and what I would also think is, and I have not read everything in the report, so maybe it's in it. It's a disappointment, I know. Yeah. Well, it's 400 pages more or less. So, but no, what I think is that I would bet actually that it could increase trust and confidence in the general public if this statement would be made. So if this statement, we have been wrong in assessing the risks of climate change, in understanding that urgent calls for action, which climate science has been emitting, I mean, since in the last 30 years, that we should have taken it seriously. And I think admitting that could also be a source of trust building, actually. And the other thing I would mention is, well, and what would be very important for that is also to stop undermining the science and understanding that science is making well thought through recommendations. And the last point here is that policymakers are giving themselves plans and strategies. And I think it is important to be clear in the monitoring of where we are making progress and where not, and to analyze the reasons for it. So monitoring the effect of policies and adjusting them if they are not producing the results. And I think that this is also something which requires a consensus on the importance of climate policy as an example, but as a very crucial example. It's no coincidence that you mentioned the number of deaths which will be produced if this is not taken seriously. So to have a continuity in the importance which is given to climate change and to climate policies across legislators. And that is something which would make people trust again in democratic procedures and democratic institutions. Now, whether we will see this is another question.
Thank you so much. I'm very tempted to ask a follow-up question, and if you allow me, I will. I'm just wondering, when you say both on the role of policymakers, but also of politicians to admit that they were wrong. I'm asking myself, in a world that is not only polarized, but where we have all this challenge of disinformation and the challenge of an internet that picks facts that, certain groups from wherever you come, and has certainly contributed, I think that I've seen that across the globe, that I think there is less boldness and less being out there and offering solutions. So I'm just wondering what role that plays and how you think we could overcome that, because I see that as a huge driving factor of politics being driven rather than being able to set an agenda.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And we have seen now with the heavy rains in Austria and Czech Republic, I'm sure you all have seen these pictures of the billboards for electoral campaigns of people who are saying, well, climate change is not so urgent. And now they are flooded, these billboards. You can use those images to say, I told you so, but you can also say, you can extend a hand and say, okay, let's start the conversation again. Of course, that would be a vote of confidence in the policymakers who had behaved differently. But I think that's, what I'm saying actually here, Melanie, is that does not only need courage to maintain your policy stance, but it also takes courage to extend the hand and to give a chance for starting anew. And to bring across the message, which I clearly also see in the HDR, or you said it also in the beginning, investing in global cooperation for global public goods will benefit us all. But what we are also seeing is that the adjustments you need to make in your daily lives, it requires an investment. So there is a price to pay. Yeah. So not in the result, but in the way we define for reaching it. There is a readjustment of expenses and an adjustment of lifestyles also. And there you need to be honest, I think, and for being honest, you need to have a minimum of trust that the political discourse between those in power and those in opposition does not go beyond certain limits. So to question the whole thing, yeah. So there needs to be a political struggle on what is the best way and what are the best instruments to reach the goal. But there should not be a struggle which questions the thing as a whole. Yeah, to say, well, there is no real urgency in climate change. I think this is, we don't have we cannot give us this luxury. It's not a luxury, it's actually leaving us into despair and disaster.
Thank you so much. I just read yesterday a report, a new study that said 1 degree increase in temperature will result in 12% loss of GDP. I think it's a very, very clear message. And we have heard, Olumide, thank you for being patient and allowing another question to Ime. And feel free to comment also on the issue of trust. But we have seen in Pedro's slides how the effect of climate change on mortality is affecting countries in the global south more than high-income countries. And we have at the moment a debate on the Summit of the Future that is, I think, about development financing versus climate financing. And there's a certain discrepancy, there's a disagreement on if this is complementary or if it's the one on the expense of the other. Obviously, from the data that we have, from how we look at it, it needs to go hand in hand. But maybe from your perspective, and from your perspective also from, I think, a lot of the work you have been doing on the African continent, if you could share some of your views on that.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to be on this excellent panel. Thanks. So I think there's an original sin when it comes to kind of separating climate finance from development finance. When the idea of having a separate amount for climate finance came up in 2009, it was supposed to be new and additional, but it wasn't clear how to define what new and additional is. And if you don't define how to separate something, it's going to be extremely hard for you to eventually count it. From what I think, and on principle alone, I would say that until we've achieved what was promised in 1972 around how much rich countries would give to support poorer countries around economic development, until we get to that amount, we can't talk about anything that is new and additional. So if we say that 0.7% of gross national income should be devoted to development finance in general, then anything above that is what we count as new and additional. But if we haven't really achieved the 0.7%, I don't understand what new and additional means. Because it's very easy to see that development financing will achieve climate goals. Building a road, upgrading a road in a hard-to-reach area where they're facing the effects of the climate crisis is at the same time development financing because it's supposed to help economic activities in that area. It's also a climate financing because it's supposed to help with people who are facing the hardest realities of the climate crisis. So it's really difficult to separate these two. And we've done the original sin of not defining how to separate them. That's why you get things like Italy claiming that building gelato shops in Asia counts as climate finance. And Belgium doing a film on climate crisis counts as climate finance. It's because we didn't agree on what new and additional means, and that's going to be a problem. It will stay a problem. And it is even a problem now defining the next amount, which is not going to be, it was supposed to be defined before the COP this year. We won't have a number until after the COP. So, I mean, it's just to be clear that we don't have a way of separating the two, and anything we do will really not account for the difference between the two. But for most global south countries, the big problem is that the pots of money is shrinking. So it isn't just that you can't identify what is development finance from what is climate finance. It's that the total pot of money that is available for doing things outside of rich countries, by rich countries, is shrinking. 2022, we got the highest amount in development financing, generally. But actually it reduced in developing countries by 4% in that year already. So for a lot of countries, the concern is that there doesn't appear to be the idea of solidarity, is not there as much. I mean, and we know why. We've talked about some of them already up here. So it's not just separating development financing from climate finance, it's also understanding that even if we lump the two of them together, the pot is shrinking.
Indeed. Thank you so much. And before we open up, Pedro, maybe reflecting on what you have heard, and I think going a bit more into the global public goods, and we've heard about shrinking financing, less money available. We have a big debate here in Germany as well, but I think this is in many countries that have traditionally been more engaged in development financing. How can we work on these global public goods when we have at the same time this shrinking budgets for development cooperation?
Thank you, Melanie. First, I want to very much agree with Olumide that let me paint a picture that's a bit of a simplification, but currently, when it comes to international flows of resources, sovereign flows from countries to countries, we have essentially two dominant motivations. One that's humanitarian based, so saving lives, and that is something that appeals quite strongly to population in high-income countries still. So it's relatively easy to do, and it's important, and we're not doing enough. And the second motivation is the development cooperation. ODA formally includes humanitarian as well, so it should be part of the 0.7. But we know that development cooperation is meant to provide countries with assistance to make investments in health, education, infrastructure, to enable countries to converge to the standards of living of high-income countries. What I think we need to be clear about is the importance of a third track of financing, which is a track in which resources flow from high-income countries to low-income countries, not because of the two motivations that I outlined, but to enable countries to make the investments needed to contribute to global public goods. And we already have the instruments. So there is something called, I don't know if you're familiar, Global Environmental Facility. The logic of the Global Environmental Facility is that imagine a low-income country that decides to invest in an energy producing facility. Doing the economics, it makes sense for this country to invest in a coal-fired power plant. And then the international community says, no, but if you do that, you're emitting greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, fine. So then pay me, international community, the difference between what I would be willing to invest myself in a coal-fired power plant and the additional cost that I need to incur, this incremental cost that I would need to incur to contribute to a global public good. So I think this is a new logic of international transfer that we need to be much more systematic about. And you see this debate, we've been talking mostly about climate, but there's a discussion going on as well on a pandemic treaty after the experience of COVID-19. It's getting stuck again on the issue of financing. And I was in contact with one high-income country, and the government wisely took the position that if they were to put resources on a pandemic treaty, it would not be accounted for as ODA. It would be new resources allocated by the Ministry of Finance. Because if they become substitute, right? If it's one at the expense of the others, then it's problematic. And it's a lose-lose proposition. Now, let me make the case as to why this is so important, this third track. So when I was working with Inga Cole on global public goods, our framing was about interdependence, but it was in the context of debates about globalization. So are we opening ourselves up too much, not enough, on trade, for instance, on capital flows, on the movement of people? And countries have a choice. They can calibrate how much they want to be open, how much they want to be interdependent. And it's a recurrent topic of debate. The point, though, and that was my last slide, is that we are now confronting challenges in which countries don't have a choice but to recognize that they are interdependent. They are living in a planet that we all share that is undergoing these planetary changes in which we actually don't have a choice. We have to confront these challenges in an integrated and collective way. So the planet is changing, climate change, biodiversity loss. We also are becoming more interconnected, not on trade, not on finance, but as a result of the digital transformation. So these are very powerful forces that are not going to go away and compel us to be much more serious about providing these global public goods. I would have a comment also on what Timur said. Do I have time? So one of the revealing things for us as we were working on the report is how different polarization is from what we have seen in the past, at least in the recent past. Because it's interesting that the challenge is not so much on how to arbitrate differences. This has always been the concern of political institutions. How can you reconcile different interests? The challenge now is how do people recognize that they actually agree on more than they think they do, which is contradictory, right? You know, and political polarization is it's a new problem. We cite this in the report. When James Madison was thinking about how to structure the Constitution of the United States, James Madison, Hamilton, others, they wrote so-called Federalist Papers. And there's one very famous, that's Federalist Paper number 10, written by Madison, and it's about factions. So Madison was worried about factions in society. And his argument was that factions would not be insular. In other words, you would have an urban dweller and a farmer, they would have different interests, but they perhaps have the same view when it comes to taxation, for instance. What we're seeing today with polarization is that people are coming together around a set of issues that becomes part of their identity. And we have to know how to deal with this. This is not about tolerating differences, as much as not losing our ability to see that we are both human, even if we are on different camps. And moreover, that actually we agree on more than we think we do. So it's a different kind of challenges. And I'm not saying this is a silver bullet that's going to solve everything. It's way too complex for that. But I think it offers a new angle as to how we can address. It's not about othering more. Some of the discourse, some of the debates, it's even going to other more. It's going to exacerbate even more this polarization. So how do we find ways in which we leverage this fact that people actually often agree on more than they think they do?
Yes, please.
Okay, I want to continue on the track that Pedro just started on. I agree that we agree on more than we disagree about in general. And I also think maybe what we need to do is to find a way to think ourselves into the perspectives of the others that we don't agree with, and try and understand why they're believing or they're behaving the way they're behaving. Because so I give you an example. Shortly after the AfD was first elected to the Bundestag, I was giving a talk at Free University. And I asked the students how many of them knew people who voted for AfD, and there were quite a few hands up. And then I said, how many of you have actually spoken to these people and asked them why they do that? What are their fears? Insecurity. What are their fears? What pressured them to think that this would fix whatever problem they thought they had? And nobody raised their hands up, because everybody just assumed that, oh no, I won't do that. But the point is, we can't reach other people without trying to understand where they're coming from. Understanding doesn't mean accepting. Understanding means having a common language to speak about the same issue. And sometimes I'm afraid that we don't have a common language to talk about the things that concern others and us at the same time. And that's a problem. And it also kind of goes along the same lines of the question you asked earlier about politicians. We live in a really difficult time now where 3 seconds of what you say could basically be what ruins your political career forever, right? But we also need politicians to be more bold. We can't run a politics where we're all going towards the lowest common denominator, right? Where we are serving electorate as if it shouldn't be our job, politicians, I'm not one, but it shouldn't be that like we're behaving as if, no, I'm not. Cool. We can't come from a position that basically treats electorates like consumers who are always right. And so we will tell them anything as long as they vote for us. Something has to change, because it can't continue like this. Because what we're going to have, if we keep doing this, is not debating the real issues and keep serving people as if what they say they're experiencing and what the worries are the most fundamental things ever. And most often they're not. Examples abound: climate change, migration, and so on. So I just feel we need more honesty, more truth, more boldness, more courage from politicians who are not only telling people what they want to hear. And this is across board.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being bold, about being bold. I think also listening to that, and then I think we would like to open the floor for questions, because I have asked enough questions already. I'm also wondering what COVID and the pandemic has played in that, in terms of losing some of the us and the other, and me and the other. Because I think it has physically separated people. I think it has accelerated online spaces where people find themselves. It has also created, I think, accelerated conspiracy theories and all of that. But before we go back to the panel, let's open up and see. We have here in the room, if we have questions, and then also online. But maybe let's start in the room, and if you could please introduce yourself and also direct your question to either one of our panelists or indicate if this is a general question and observation. Thank you. And thank you for breaking the ice. Please.
My name is Chris Kowalewski. I'm a member of Transparency International Germany and also representative to the UN Global Compact Network in Germany. So I'll be talking about corruption, obviously, and I'd like to hear your appreciation of the general panel of the role of corruption, right, in polarization, in the issues that you mentioned, climate change, COVID, you name it. I would talk, when we talk about destruction, I would obviously emphasize the destructive power it has on trust, on everything that we've talked about. So I'm not as surprised when we look about the democratic paradox, because even Democrats on the highest level have over and over again been involved in corruption scandals, which has obviously affected trust. And then there's this very particular effect on the tribalism effect. So once polarized, everybody defends his side or her side, and then we have the accountability aspect being heavily affected, because I don't question my guy because he's on my side, etc. And that makes it even harder, to come up with an honesty initiative, integrity initiative. But this is definitely something that we very much need. And I saw briefly when I looked into the report that there was something on agency as an answer to corruption. So I'm interested to hear more about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wonderful. Very, very good. Let's take one more question from the room and one more online, and then give it back to the panel. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Aditi Dey. I'm a public policy researcher by profession, but currently I'm a student here in Berlin. My question, Pedro, is to you about the global common goods and how do you envision it being implemented in a way where it doesn't, come at a cost for countries which are less developed or are still developing? Because you invoke the example of the pandemic, and I can't help think of the situation with the vaccines, where this was supposed to be something that is commonly available to everybody, yet there was so much contention about the type of vaccine you have, whether you're allowed to be in certain spaces in certain countries because of that, despite wherever they were being manufactured, and the formula and the private sector involved in that. So I just can't help but think of how you can implement such a thing, even with the architecture that you describe, where the people who are most vulnerable, the countries who are most vulnerable, are not, again, become more vulnerable because of this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think very clear example on how cooperation didn't work. Sophie?
Yeah, we have one question online as well, and this relates to a topic that was quite controversially discussed in the German media, but also on social media in January. Basically, the cycle paths in Peru and whether the German government should fund cycle paths in Peru. And just to add, it was obviously also a lot of populist criticism surrounding that debate. And so the question is, will the explanation of global public goods also help to explain investments like this particular project better?
I moved back to Germany in January after 20 years, and the first thing I learned is that there's a big controversy, Pedro, about bike lanes in Peru. And I think my colleagues from the development ministry, they are probably a bit tired of explaining that, because it was a development ministry finance project, and obviously then I talked, our res rep Bettina was here, and I said, do you know how famous you are here from Peru? And then she said, yeah, they're following the debates, but it was about why we, and obviously it made a lot of sense, because Peru and urbanization, it's a big city and it is investing in green transport, it's investing in these bike lanes, but it has become a bit the symbolism of questioning why you invest in development cooperation and what the result of it is. And I think it has been very absurd in many ways, this discussion, but I just wanted to put that why you want to ask questions about bike lanes in Peru.
I think it was all Bettina's fault.
Sorry?
It was all Bettina's fault.
Exactly.
She's a very good friend, so I have to apologize in advance.
Yeah. Good, but I think the question is good on how that stands as an example. So maybe we start with a question on corruption, which I think is a very important one. And I don't know who wants to share some observations.
I can quickly, because I think the way in which you posed your question, you already indicated something that I share. I think corruption is always problematic, but it is particularly problematic in context of political polarization. Why? Because people are geared towards collaborating with so-called in-groups, right? With those with whom they have an affinity with. It's more challenging to cooperate at larger scales. So for instance, to cooperate at the scale of a nation, collectively, decisions have to be made on allocating resources on behalf of the entire nation. In a context of polarization, political polarization, where we have society divided in these groups, corruption undermines even more the possibility of getting to this collective action. Because then it's perceived as those that belong to that in-group, however it's defined, could be a political party, could be a business interest, they are protecting themselves. They are looking after each other. So makes this kind of bridging that we were talking about more and more difficult. Robert Putnam is a professor at an American university, has this very interesting proposition. He says that we are made to bond within groups, but we need to find ways of bridging across groups. So bonding and bridging. So corruption is very good at bonding, right? Because then within the group you protect each other, but it's very, very detrimental to bridging. And in a context of polarization, we need to invest in bridging across groups. And corruption is a killer when it comes to bridging.
Thank you so much. Ime, any thoughts on corruption? And I see
I think
was nodding a lot. I think he has to share also some.
Yeah, I think when corruption is detected, then you can also have a two sides result. You can have it can contribute to increasing trust in those authorities who have to discover corruption. So yes, they are working. So this is why we see corruption now. But it can also be turned the other direction. You see, our society is corrupt. You cannot trust anybody. And and then there is also accusation of corruption when it's not about corruption, like politicians or parliamentarians are often blamed to be corrupt in the sense that they earn so much money being a member of parliament, and what do they do with it? It's just a way of earning their lives without taking seriously the responsibility they have to the whole of society and so on. So I think what is important is to deal with it I'm not criticizing transparency at all here, you don't get me wrong, but I think creating myths about corruption is one topic used by polarization. So I think the work of transparency is very important in showing where corruption exists and where not. So I think that is to take the ground on which polarizing discourses work away. I think that is very important.
Thank you. Olumide?
Thank you. As I was hearing the question from Zoom, I was wondering whether that's not a symptom of polarization itself, that paying for a bike path in Peru becomes such a hot topic that people have to be defending things, whether that's itself a symptom of the polarized debates within Germany. But to the point on corruption, so I'm going to go fairly academic here. There was an article written in the 70s by a Nigerian political scientist, which sort of said that in many African countries, especially Nigeria as an example, there's a difference between, there are two publics, right? There's a sort of more intimate public, and there's a more public. So the intimate public is your ethnic group, your age grade, the people, your tribe, right? If we're going to use a more sort of current political language, your group. Within that group, it's okay if you take money from the larger outside public to take care of the in-group, right? So that becomes your legitimacy within your group, the more private public, is enhanced if you can take care of people who need you. And very often there are serious material needs around you that you can support with the money that you steal from the more public space. So I think I'm just sort of trying to expand the way we understand corruption a little bit here, which of course doesn't mean that we condone it. It's all bad. And in a climate in which everything is polarized, your in-group becomes more closed in and kind of appreciates more what you do for them, even if they don't need it materially, right? They defend you, you're part of their tribe. A political tribe doesn't mean they're related to you biologically, but part of your political tribe. So, I mean, my wonder is, how does one overcome that in this polarized environment? And I don't have an answer, because my worry is the more the politics get polarized, the more we're going to see people justifying things that are just not justifiable. And we're seeing that happen in the US, for example, where, you know, debates, I'm hearing people who I thought of great integrity making some really problematic statements. So I don't have a real answer to the question of how we bridge those divides, but we have to try and do it. Otherwise, we stop speaking the same language. And if we can't agree on what is factual anymore, and we're at the point where we almost can't agree on what is facts, because there are alternative facts, then we're in trouble. Like, we're in real trouble, and we have so many issues to deal with together, not just together as countries, but together as a global community. I mean, just trying to make sure we don't overshoot 2 degrees is one very basic one, because if we do, life becomes impossible in many parts of the world. So we have to find a way to bridge these gaps, and I don't have a good answer for you.
And we agree more than we think, but yet we cannot do the next step. Imme, you wanted to come in again.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on this cycling path thing. What I find troubling is that this it is kind of a campaign to undermine the societal consensus on it makes sense to invest in international cooperation, and it makes sense to invest in poverty alleviation. And in global public goods too, because that's what all came together in this cycling path, actually. And the purpose of that was actually to say, we have this budget of the BMZ, all the money we need to put elsewhere, let's just take it from there, because why do we do it we are not in the position anymore to do that. And this it's a campaign to undermine this shared belief by broad parts of society, actually, that international cooperation makes sense, investing in global public goods such as climate protection, as we say in German, also makes sense, and it makes sense to invest in solving the problem instead of paying the price of not solving it. The costs of inaction are higher than that. And it's, again, what I find troubling is that these political discourses are made knowing that this discourse knows actually that there is broad support in the electorate for that. So it is purposeful destruction, yeah. And so I'm just describing the problem. I'm not saying where the answer is, but probably one part of the answer could be by showing how high the willingness to give for making donations in times of catastrophe, for example, still is. I mean, when you ask the large donation-based organizations, they see a certain decline, but it's not large. Yeah, so probably we would need positive counter-narratives which show where society actually acts, and contrary to what these destructive discourses claim. And it probably needs to be a very specific version adapted to the culture. You also have this embeddedness, cultural embeddedness. I think that is very important. So the discourse which can counter these negative narratives will probably be very different in Germany and in the US or in Nigeria. So I think that is something to invest in. But it has to be done by building on this understanding that we are all humans and there are tasks for humanity to cope with as a whole, where single nations cannot deal with. And I also think that it requires more honesty about how we engage in international cooperation. So this point about having a new international architecture, I think it also means to recalibrate the discourse on why on cooperation also serving own interests. So it's not all altruism. Yeah, I think that is very important because it's in our interest to have a more peaceful world. Yeah, and increasing inequalities make that impossible. But at the same time, it also means when we engage in, we have all these cooperations now between Germany or the EU with other countries for containing migration or for making global value chains more secure. And I think in these partnerships and cooperations, we also need to make clear space for the interest of the countries we are working with. So, so that these partnerships or cooperations actually fulfill several purposes at once. So you differentiated these financial streams, but I think that cooperation for the 21st century needs to address these different objectives, all of them. And of course, that makes it difficult for the accountability but I think that can all be solved. But then I think it requires to rethink ODA and to rethink the way we say this is the ministry for ODA and this is the ministry for national interest. Yeah, so I think this doesn't make sense anymore, also not for our partners. The first to question that are our partners. Yeah. They say, why do you do this? Be honest. And why do you separate it like that?
Very true. And I think in all of this, there's also a communication issue. I think this is a fascinating debate. We are a bit over time, but I don't want to stop it. And I don't know if here you still are ready for 5 more minutes before we serve drinks. Then we will continue. But in answering, please do not forget the question about the vaccines. That was addressed to you, Pedro. So if you can respond or react to what Immer has said and answer that question, and then we go to Olumide, then I think we do also justice to this question because it was a very good one.
Well, on vaccines, I think the evidence is clear that it was a moral failure of the international community. I mean, many efforts were made, but in the end it was corrected. But in the heat of the moment, it was a moral failure. And we give this example in the report. I don't know if you remember, but there was a variant of the virus, the new virus, called Omicron. You remember this when it appeared? Omicron? So this variant was identified for the first time, I don't know if you remember, in South Africa. So South Africa made a service to the international community. Watch out, there's a new variety, here is the genetic sequencing. What did high-income countries do? Do you remember? No more flights to South Africa. So there was a deep sense of injustice from many countries during the COVID-19 pandemic, and many of the difficulties that we confront today still in the international debate have to do with this deep sense of injustice. I wanted to come back, though, to this point, because the report also has something that I thought was very interesting. So there is a potential concern that if the population in a country like Germany, for instance, supports humanitarian action, and it goes back to some extent to the Peru controversy, to the best I understand it. But so people are motivated to help others to save lives. That's a very compelling argument, moral argument. It's also compelling to help countries that have low incomes to reduce poverty, right? But then the question is, are people equally motivated to help countries to address climate change, which is the bicycle lanes in a sense? What the evidence shows, which I think is very interesting, is that people seem to have moral boundaries that are different and have different scope. And in other words, people attribute different welfare, different weight to the welfare of others in different social circles. So we all care about our family a lot. we all care about our community a lot, but some people attribute also weight to the welfare of others very far away. And if you attribute weight to the welfare of others very far away, the reason is not that relevant, which is interesting. There are results in the survey, in the report, that you should look at. So whether you say it's to save lives, whether you say it's for poverty, whether it says to address global challenges, people always support it. So this kind of controversy plays into the hands of those that attribute a low welfare weight to those living far away, but it's not going to change the convictions, the beliefs of those that attribute a higher welfare weight to those living abroad. So sometimes seen as cosmopolitan, or more universalist versus more, I forget the word, parochial, more parochial. And this is not to say that some people are better than others. I think this is very important. They are very good people because they care about others, but they care about others that are closer to them. And these things are also seem to be very, very robust. They don't seem to change very much. So I think we need to be mindful of this heterogeneity across the population. So it's true, the majority of the population in most countries, most high-income countries, is favorable to international because they have these larger moral boundaries. But some don't, and some won't necessarily. We won't be able to change their minds necessarily. And this doesn't make them bad people. They're excellent people, right? So it's another interesting finding for me, at least, because I was concerned with this idea, okay, so if we propose this third track, will that undermine domestic support to ODA, for instance? And this evidence is reassuring because it suggests it won't. In other words, these three flows, instead of being substitutes, are actually complements. Now, the political reality is different, right? But in terms of public support, there is no substitution.
Yeah. Olumide.
Just very quickly, I think, just to come back to what Ime said, I think there was already the perception anyway that this was an altruism. Owning up to it now is simply catching up to what the partners already think. And in a really interesting way, I think having to explain domestically in Germany that development cooperation is in Germany's interest is, in a sense, extending the hand to the other side. So we're not saying that, what do you mean? How did you understand that this is important? But actually explaining that Germany has gained so much from multilateralism. Germany has gained so much from a world that was rule-based, right? And that part of having a rule-based world is funding it. Right? Part of having multilateral systems that work and that work for Germany, I know some of them are no longer working well, WTO example, but part of having a system that works for Germany and that delivered for Germany, and that Germany pulled off a success that no country has ever done, really, in the world, which is to be an economic might without being a military might. To pull that off is because there was a multilateral system that allowed this to happen. And it's in Germany's interest for this to continue. So having politicians come to explain this, I think is actually a positive thing, because it's saying, I understand the people who don't count so much on the others. I understand your point of view, but I'm going to explain to you why what you think is probably not correct. So I think that's actually a good thing.
Thank you, and I think it comes back to the next panel we will do, because we will not manage this today, is I think the key underlying issue is how do we find the time, the space to communicate all of that, and to communicate the interdependence, to communicate the paradoxes, to communicate all of the data that in a way makes sense, but you cannot present that in 5 minutes. And it's not a tweet. This requires discussions, explanations, and I think this dialogue that I think all of you have mentioned. Oliver told me that there's one important question on the Summit of the Future in the online space. Is that in the room? Okay, then let's take this.
Thank you. My name is Dania Schulze. I'm an undergraduate student in political science and an intern at the UNA Germany at the moment. And my question would be, as you mentioned, the importance of international cooperation and the need for more cooperation so often in the panel and in the speeches, what are your expectations for the Summit of the Future on that? And what impact, or what's your impression on the impact the Summit of the Future could have on actually maybe, as a hopeful view, breaking the gridlock? Yeah, thank you.
Very easy question to finish. Pedro.
So I'll respond simply by saying that it's an expression that we agree on more than we think we do. So when we look at the Pact of the Future, and there's a draft that's publicly available, and I think it's on its way to be formally approved, it's an encapsulation on the many things that we agree. It might not be enough, it might want more ambition, but at least it's a starting point to recognizing that we agree on more than we think we do.
So this is like the final round, right?
Absolutely.
And I think it's great. It's a very good question for that.
Yeah.
So my building on what Pedro just said, my expectation is also that as the Pact of the Future won't be perfect and answer all questions, that it is a starting point for a process which takes seriously the need to reform and update and strengthen multilateral institutions so that international cooperation has the right basis to work with challenges in the 21st century.
Olumide?
So someone who is close to a global leader was saying once that we underestimate the power of inserting a line into a president's speech, because sometimes that's the line you need for the ministry to do something about it. So maybe part of what we'll get out of the Summit of the Future isn't exactly the summit doing something, but the summit being a tool that can then be used by people with power in countries to make things happen. So this is a commitment we've made internationally. How about we actually do something about it? So that's my hope that I'm attaching to the summit next week.
Thank you so much, and I think that's very true. For me, I abuse my role now a bit. I think the fact that we have this discussion in the United Nations in New York, controversially on all of these issues, in a world that we see is so polarized, I think is an achievement in itself, and we hope that indeed what you say, that there are 1 or 2 or 3 hooks that come out of it on the different topics that allow us, maybe even in Hamburg, but now Dirk is gone, to make a step forward in the right direction. Let me thank, first of all, Pedro for coming all the way, Ime and Olumide for coming from Kreuzberg, and I think you are still in Mitte, not so far, but for making the way and for taking the time. Thank you again for DGVN, and I would like to thank Oliver, Dania, Sophie, and Julian and Sebastian from the DGVN team and from my team who have made all of this happen. And I would like to invite all of you for drinks that are served outside, and I think there's much more time to continue the discussion. Thank you very much.